All right, ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to do set 62, complex roots of quadratic equations. So we've talked about the letter I in imaginary numbers. So when we have a square root of a negative, you're going to split it into square root of 8 times negative 1. We know the square root of negative 1 is going to turn into I. And then 8 we're going to break into 2 and 4. So 2 times 4 gives us 8. So we end up with 2, square root of 2, and then the I comes after, but we want to make sure that it's out from underneath the square root sign. Then, if we have a quadratic answer, like we've seen this before, we can change this into this answer here. So instead of leaving the negative in there, we want to get that out, and we can change it to 2 plus or minus the square, or 2 plus or minus 2 square root of 2, and then that I. And so this is how we would write our answer without that negative in that square root. All right, so if we're going to get this quadratic equation and it tells us to solve it by completing the square, we first want to move over our 5 term. Okay, and remember we leave some space, and then we're at minus 5 plus then some space. Completing the square, we take half of the middle term, and then we're going to square it. And that goes in both of those blanks. So we get 4 and 4. Okay, this here is going to turn into x plus 2 squared. Remember, that's really simple. You don't have to do the factoring out because it's going to be x plus or minus whatever your half b term is, and then that whole quantity squared. Equals negative 5 plus 4 gives us negative 1. Okay, now to simplify here, we need to get rid of that squared by taking the square root. So we have x plus 2 equals the square root of negative 1. The square root of negative 1 we know we can replace with I, and that's a plus minus. Okay, and then we're just going to go ahead and subtract the 2 over to the other side. So we have x equals negative 2 plus or minus I. So there's really not much difference here than doing normal completing the square. We just, when we have that negative, we're going to take it out and move it into I. So let's do a few more examples. Okay, same setup here. We're going to move our plus 2 to the other side by subtracting it. Leave some space in both of these. Okay. Half of my b term is negative 1. I'm going to square it and add it to both sides. So I'm adding in a positive 1. This here, you could go through and factor, but we don't need to do all that work because we know it's just going to be x minus 1, because that was our b term, squared, equals, here we get negative 1. We're going to take the square root on both sides. So we get x minus 1 equals, we have the square root of negative 1, that turns into I. So plus or minus I. Go ahead and add 1 to both sides. So x equals 1 plus or minus I. All right, so this one's a little bit different because we have that coefficient here. So we're just going to go through and divide everything by 3. When we do complete the square, we want our leading coefficient to be 1. So we're just going to leave this as negative 2/3. And I'm going to go ahead and move over this 2/3 to the other side. Okay, we're going to take half of that middle term. Half of negative 2/3 is the same thing as multiplying by half. So I'm just going to multiply across. We get negative 2 over 6. And I'm going to reduce that to negative 1/3. So half of 2/3 is negative 1/3. The other thing you can think of is I have 2/3, so I have 1/3 and 1/3, so I have half of that. All right, square both sides and add it in. So that becomes 1/9 to both sides. So this is where this part here, you could go through and factor it, but we know we can use our shortcut here. So we have x minus 1/3 squared equals negative 2/3 plus 1/9. We need to make common denominator, so I'm going to times both by 3. So I get negative 6/9 plus 1/9, so I have negative 5 over 9. Square root on both sides. So x minus 1/3. Here you need to take the square root of the top and the bottom. We end up with square root of negative 5 on the top. So we're going to split that into square root of negative 1 and square root of 5. So that gives us square root of 5i. Remember the I comes after. It's still a plus minus. And square root of 9 is going to give us 3. Okay, last step, we're going to add that 1/3 over to the other side. So we have 1/3 plus or minus the square root of 5i over 3. And since they have a common denominator, let's write them as a fraction altogether, all over 3. All right, so here if we look at this one, my terms are in a little bit different order. So let's go ahead and move this 5 over and move 6x over. So we have 2x squared plus 6, oops, not plus, minus 6x. I'm going to leave a space, equals, and I'm going to have negative 5 and a space. Now remember here we have a coefficient of 2, so we need to divide everything by 2. We want that leading coefficient to be 1. Okay. So half of negative 3 is going to give us negative 3 halves. Halves. We're going to square it and add it to both sides. So we get negative 9. Nope, we get a positive 9 over 4. Okay, remember this, we can use our shortcut using our b term. X minus 3 over 2 squared equals, these are not common denominators over here, so I'm going to times by 2 on both of those. So I have negative 10 over 4 plus 9 over 4. So that's going to give me negative 1/4. Okay, so I square root on both sides. I get x minus 3 over 2 equals my negative, square root of negative 1 turns into an I in the numerator. Square root of 4 turns into a 2. And then we still have our plus minus. We're going to go ahead and add 3 halves. So x equals 3 halves plus or minus I over 2. Or they have a common denominator, so we can write it as 3 plus or minus I over 2. I'd prefer this method, but this method is also acceptable. All right, let us know if you have questions.